Here's the paradox no one wants to explain. In February 2022, the West unleashed what they called the nuclear option of economic warfare, cutting Russia from SWIFT. The ruble was supposed to collapse. The economy was supposed to implode. Putin was supposed to fall. 2.5 years later, Russia's economy is growing faster than Germany's. So either the most powerful financial weapon in history failed spectacularly, or it was never really a weapon at all. This isn't about headlines or hot takes. This is about a pattern that's repeated 4 times in 110 years, and what it means for the next 20. Let me show you what actually happened. On the morning of February 26, 2022, Dmitry Volkov woke up in his apartment in St. Petersburg to find his entire life savings frozen. At 53 years old, after 28 years as a mechanical engineer, Dmitry had accumulated roughly $47,000 in a dollar-denominated account. His retirement, his daughter's wedding fund, his safety net against the chaos that Russians his age had learned to expect. He remembers standing in his kitchen, phone in hand, watching the notification appear on his screen. Account access suspended. International transactions blocked. Outside his window, snow was falling on Nevsky Prospect, and for a moment, he said later, the world felt like it had simply stopped. 2 days earlier, Russian tanks had crossed into Ukraine. Now the West had responded with what they called the most devastating financial strike since World War II. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, the mood was triumphant. Treasury officials spoke of maximum economic pressure. European leaders declared this would cripple Putin's war machine. The footage you'd see on every news channel showed the same thing. A graph of the ruble crashing, losing 40% of its value in 72 hours. The line plummeting like a stone dropped from a skyscraper. Economists predicted Russian GDP would contract by 15%. Some said 20%. The consensus was absolute. Russia would collapse within months. But here's what most people get wrong about that moment. They think the SWIFT cutoff was about punishing Russia. It wasn't. Or rather, that was the surface story. The deeper truth, the one that would reshape the global financial system, is that the SWIFT weapon was never really about Russia at all. It was a message to every country on Earth. This is what happens when you cross us. Your money isn't yours. Your trade isn't yours. Your economy exists because we allow it to exist. And in sending that message, the United States made the most catastrophic strategic miscalculation of the 21st century. Let me give you a number that should keep you up at night. In 2022, before the sanctions, 61% of global central bank reserves were held in US dollars. By late 2024, that number had fallen to 57%, a decline that took 30 years to achieve previously, compressed into less than 3. But that headline number hides something more alarming. Among non-Western central banks, the countries that watched the SWIFT cutoff and understood they could be next, the shift has been even more dramatic. We're going to examine exactly who moved their money and where it went. But first, you need to understand the human cost on both sides of this financial war. Maria Santos was 61 years old when the sanctions hit. She'd spent her entire career at a logistics company in Rotterdam that specialized in moving Russian grain to African markets. Within 3 weeks of the SWIFT cutoff, her company lost access to payment channels for transactions worth $340 million annually. She remembers the exact meeting. A Tuesday afternoon, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the CEO explaining that they couldn't process payments from Russian counterparties anymore. Not because the grain was sanctioned, it wasn't, but because the banks were terrified of secondary sanctions. We had contracts to feed people, she told a reporter later. Actual human beings who needed wheat, and we couldn't move money. By June, Maria was unemployed. The company survived by pivoting entirely to European markets, but at half its previous size. Now contrast that with Chen Wei, a 38-year-old software engineer in Shanghai who works for a company you've probably never heard of. It's called CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, China's alternative to SWIFT. In February 2022, Chen's team had around 1,300 participating financial institutions on their platform. Today, that number has more than doubled. Chen doesn't remember a specific moment of triumph. What he remembers is the pace suddenly changing. Before the sanctions, he said in an interview with a Chinese financial publication, "We had maybe 10 inquiries a month from foreign banks wanting to join. After February 2022, we had 10 a day." Picture the office, screens glowing with transaction data, engineers working double shifts, the quiet satisfaction of building something that suddenly mattered to half the world. Here's the question nobody in Washington seems to be asking. If the SWIFT weapon was supposed to isolate Russia, why did it instead accelerate the construction of a parallel financial system that now includes China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and over 50 other nations? And here's the even more uncomfortable question. Why does this exact pattern? Dominant power weaponizes financial infrastructure. Targets find alternatives. Neutral countries hedge. Their weapon loses power. Why does it repeat every single time? We'll trace the 4 historical precedents later, but understand this now. What happened to Britain after 1914, what happened to sterling after 1944, is happening to the dollar right now. The timeline is almost identical. The stages are almost identical. The only difference is speed. Back in St. Petersburg, Dmitry Volkov eventually got access to his savings, in rubles, at a devastated exchange rate. He lost roughly 30% of his life's work in the currency conversion. But here's the detail that matters. His daughter's wedding happened anyway, in September 2023. Smaller than planned, different venue, but it happened. And when Dmitry speaks about it now, he doesn't talk about anger at the West. He talks about a lesson learned. "We trusted their system," he says. "We won't make that mistake again." That sentiment, that exact phrase, is now the unofficial motto of central bankers from Riyadh to Mumbai to Brasilia. They watched Russia survive. They watched the ruble recover. They watched Russian oil keep flowing, just priced in yuan and rupees instead of dollars. And they understood something that Western policymakers still refuse to accept. The SWIFT weapon didn't work. And because it didn't work, it will never work again. But to understand why, to truly grasp the mechanism that's now unwinding American financial dominance, you need to see what SWIFT actually is, how it came to control the nervous system of global commerce, and why the decision to weaponize it triggered a countdown that cannot be stopped. To understand why cutting Russia from SWIFT backfired so catastrophically, you first need to understand what SWIFT actually is, and more importantly, what it isn't. Because what most people get wrong is they think SWIFT moves money. It doesn't. Not a single dollar, not a single euro, not a single ruble has ever traveled through SWIFT. Think of it this way. SWIFT is the postal service, not the package. When a bank in Tokyo needs to send $50 million to a bank in Sao Paulo, SWIFT carries the message, the instructions, the authorization, the confirmation. The actual money moves through a completely different system called correspondent banking. SWIFT is just the communication network that makes sure everyone agrees on what's supposed to happen. Here's a simple comparison. Imagine you're at a restaurant and you want to split the bill with 3 friends. You could pass cash around the table. That's the actual money moving. But first, you need to agree on who owes what. You text each other, you show the receipt, you confirm the amounts. That texting? That's SWIFT. It's the conversation that makes the transaction possible.
Now imagine someone could read all your texts, block specific messages, and decide which friends are allowed to coordinate payments. That's the power the United States has over global finance. SWIFT was created in 1973 by 239 banks from 15 countries. Before that, international payments relied on a system called telex, slow, error-prone, and about as secure as writing your bank details on a postcard. SWIFT standardized everything: secure messaging, universal codes, instant confirmation. By 1977, they were processing 10 million messages a year. By 2024, that number had exploded to 11 billion, roughly 45 million messages every single day. Picture a room filled with servers, each one humming with the pulse of global commerce. $5 trillion in transactions flowing through those circuits every 24 hours. SWIFT became the nervous system of the world economy. But here's where the mechanism gets interesting. SWIFT is headquartered in Belgium. It's technically governed by a board representing banks from multiple countries. On paper, it's neutral. In practice, it's anything but. And the reason comes down to a single geographic fact. Most international transactions settle in US dollars, and most dollar transactions clear through New York. This means American regulators have legal jurisdiction over virtually every significant international payment. They can subpoena records. They can impose fines. They can pressure SWIFT to exclude specific banks or entire countries. The formal structure says SWIFT is international. The actual power says SWIFT is American. Hossein Sharifi learned this the hard way. In 2012, at 44 years old, Hossein ran a mid-sized textile export business in Tehran. He'd spent 15 years building relationships with buyers in Germany, Italy, and Turkey. His company employed 63 people. When the United States pressured SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks that year, Hossein's world collapsed in stages. First, the German buyers couldn't wire payments. Then the Italian contracts fell through because the insurance companies wouldn't cover shipments they couldn't verify. Within 6 months, Hossein had laid off 40 of his workers. He remembers standing in his empty warehouse, bolts of fabric stacked against the walls, machines silent, the smell of dust where there used to be the smell of work, and thinking, we didn't do anything wrong. We just made cloth. The Iran sanctions were a test case, and by conventional metrics, they worked. Iranian oil exports dropped by half. GDP contracted 9%. Inflation hit 45%. The economic pain eventually drove Iran to negotiate, leading to the 2015 nuclear deal. Western policymakers called it a success. But here's the contrarian point nobody wanted to hear. Iran learned. During those years of isolation, Iranian businesses built workarounds, barter arrangements with Turkey, gold for oil swaps with India, cryptocurrency channels that bypassed traditional banking entirely. When sanctions returned in 2018, Iran survived better than expected. The weapon had worked once. It would never work as well again. Now let me show you why this pattern isn't new, and why what happened to Britain a century ago is about to happen to America. In August 1914, when World War I began, the British pound sterling was the undisputed king of global finance. Britain controlled roughly 65% of international reserves. The city of London was where the world's money slept at night. If you were a merchant in Argentina or a factory owner in Japan, your wealth was denominated in pounds because nothing else was as safe, as liquid, as universally accepted. Then Britain made a choice that seemed logical at the time. They weaponized that dominance. The Trading with the Enemy Act gave Britain the power to freeze German assets anywhere in the British Empire. German companies lost factories. German banks lost deposits. German ships were seized in ports from Cape Town to Singapore. The immediate effect was devastating for Germany. But watch what happened next. Neutral countries, Sweden, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Argentina, even the United States, watched Britain seize private assets for political reasons. And they asked themselves a question that still echoes today. If Britain can do this to Germany, what stops them from doing it to us? Remember Dmitry Volkov from St. Petersburg, standing in his kitchen, watching his savings freeze. In 1914, there were thousands of Dmitrys, merchants in Stockholm, bankers in Zurich, exporters in Buenos Aires, all suddenly realizing that their money in London wasn't really their money. It belonged to Britain, and Britain had just demonstrated it could take it whenever politics demanded. After the war, capital began flowing out of London. Not dramatically, slowly, quietly, in small increments that barely made headlines. New York banks gained customers, Swiss vaults filled with gold. By 1944, 30 years after Britain weaponized finance, the pound sterling was finished as the world's reserve currency. The Bretton Woods Conference that year formally crowned the dollar as king. Britain hadn't lost a military war for global dominance. Britain had lost a trust war, and trust, once broken, doesn't repair. So here's the question you should be asking. If weaponizing financial infrastructure cost Britain its reserve currency status in 30 years, what happens when America does the same thing in an era when information travels at the speed of light and alternatives can be built in months instead of decades? We'll examine exactly how China, Russia, and the BRICS nations constructed their escape routes, and why the timeline for dollar decline is accelerating beyond anything Washington predicted. But first, you need to see the moment when everything shifted. Because there was one decision, 1 month, one announcement that turned theoretical risk into immediate action. In March 2022, just weeks after the SWIFT cutoff, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman did something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He took a phone call from Beijing and began discussions about pricing oil in yuan. The petrodollar system, the foundation of American financial hegemony since 1974, had just received its first crack. And that crack is now a fracture spreading across the entire architecture of global finance. Here's the official story you were told in 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine. The West responded with unprecedented sanctions. Russia was cut from SWIFT, its central bank reserves frozen, its oligarchs targeted. The ruble collapsed. Victory was imminent. Putin would fall, or at least retreat, because no economy could survive being severed from the global financial system. Now here's what actually happened. Within 60 days of the SWIFT cutoff, the ruble had recovered to pre-war levels. Within 6 months, Russia was running a current account surplus, meaning more money was flowing into Russia than out. By 2023, the Russian economy grew faster than Germany's, faster than Britain's, faster than Japan's. The nuclear option of financial warfare hadn't just failed. It had backfired so spectacularly that it triggered the largest reorganization of global finance since Bretton Woods. So let me ask you a question that should bother you. If the most powerful financial weapon in human history couldn't bring down Russia, an economy smaller than Italy's, what exactly does that say about the weapon? The answer reveals the greatest strategic miscalculation of the 21st century. Remember Chen Wei, the software engineer at CIPS in Shanghai, who watched foreign bank inquiries jump from 10 per month to 10 per day? His counterpart in Moscow is a woman named Yelena Kozlova. At 36 years old, Yelena manages integration systems for SPFS, Russia's equivalent of SWIFT, built precisely for the moment that arrived in February 2022. She remembers the week the sanctions hit. Her team had been running drills for years, testing backup systems, preparing for a day everyone hoped would never come. When it did, they were ready.
"We switched over in 72 hours," she said in an interview with a Russian technology publication. Picture the operations center. Screens tracking transaction flows. Engineers confirming each bank connection. A quiet intensity replacing the panic that Western policymakers expected. The Americans thought we'd collapse. We'd been preparing for this for 8 years. Here's the contrarian point that Western media refuses to acknowledge. Russia saw this coming. The first swift threats emerged after Crimea in 2014. Russia spent 8 years building alternatives. SPFS for domestic transactions. Bilateral payment channels with China and India. Gold reserves that tripled to over 2,300 tons. When the weapon finally deployed, Russia had already built the bunker. But Russia's survival isn't even the main story. The main story is what happened next. What happened in Riyadh, in Delhi, in Brasilia, in every capital that watched the swift cutoff and understood the message. You could be next. Pause this video for a moment and consider something. The United States froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. $300 billion that Russia had earned through legitimate trade, held in Western banks as a safety net, as insurance against crisis. Gone overnight. Not seized through legal process. Not confiscated after a court ruling. Just frozen by executive decision because Russia had crossed a political line. Now imagine you're a finance minister in Saudi Arabia, or India, or Brazil. You have hundreds of billions in dollar reserves, money your country earned, money meant to protect your citizens against economic shocks. And you just watched America demonstrate that those reserves aren't really yours. They're yours only as long as Washington approves of your government's decisions. What do? You start moving your money. This is the rage moment. This is what should make you angry regardless of your politics. Central bank reserves exist to protect ordinary people, to stabilize currencies, to fund imports during crises, to prevent the kind of economic chaos that destroys middle-class savings and pushes families into poverty. When the U.S. froze Russian reserves, they didn't hurt Putin. Putin's personal wealth was already hidden in places sanctions couldn't reach. They hurt people like Dmitry Volkov, the engineer in St. Petersburg, who lost 30% of his life savings in the currency chaos. They hurt pensioners whose fixed incomes collapsed with the ruble. They hurt small business owners who couldn't access dollars to pay for imported equipment. The elites survived. They always do. The sanctions hit the people who had nothing to do with the invasion, nothing to do with the Kremlin's decisions, nothing to do with anything except being born in the wrong country at the wrong time. And every finance minister in the global South understood this. If America could impoverish ordinary Russians to punish their government, America could impoverish ordinary Indians, ordinary Brazilians, ordinary Saudis, ordinary anyone for any political disagreement Washington deemed important. The exodus from dollar reserves began immediately. In Delhi, a 53-year-old central bank official named Arun Raghavan was part of the team that redesigned India's reserve strategy. He won't speak on record. He still works for the government. But colleagues described the atmosphere in March 2022 as controlled urgency. India began aggressively diversifying out of dollars. Gold purchases accelerated. Yuan holdings increased. Most significantly, India started settling oil purchases from Russia in rupees, something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. "We watched them freeze Russian money," one official told a financial journalist off the record. "We decided we would never be that vulnerable." Here's what most people get wrong about this moment. They think countries are choosing between the dollar and alternatives because they prefer China or Russia. They're not. They're choosing between the dollar and alternatives because America demonstrated the dollar is a weapon, and nobody wants to hold a weapon pointed at their own head. This brings us to March 2022 and the phone call that cracked the foundation of American financial hegemony. Remember Mohammed bin Salman and the conversation about pricing oil in yuan? That wasn't a casual diplomatic courtesy. That was the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, the country that has priced every barrel of oil in dollars since 1974, exploring the unthinkable. The petrodollar system, which we'll examine in detail later, is the bedrock of dollar reserve status. It's the reason every country on earth needs dollars. If Saudi Arabia breaks that link, even partially, the entire architecture of American financial dominance begins to crumble. And here's the twist nobody in Washington expected. Saudi Arabia wasn't doing this because they hate America. They were doing it because they're smart. They watched Russia get cut off and realized their own $400 billion in overseas reserves could vanish with a single American policy decision. They watched China become their largest oil customer and understood that eventually, the customer who buys the most gets to choose the currency. They did the math, and the math said, diversify now, before it's too late. Ravi Menon was 58 years old and running monetary policy at the Central Bank of Singapore when the sanctions hit. Singapore isn't Russia. Singapore isn't China. Singapore is perhaps America's closest ally in Southeast Asia, a model of Western-aligned economic development. But even Menon understood the implications. At a conference in late 2022, he said something that should have made headlines worldwide. The weaponization of finance has changed the calculus for every central bank on Earth. Picture the conference hall. Rows of central bankers, economists, finance ministers, all nodding silently, all thinking the same thing. The rules have changed. The system we trusted is now a system we fear. By late 2023, BRICS announced plans for a new payment system independent of SWIFT. By early 2024, more than 50 countries had expressed interest in joining or aligning with the bloc. Gold purchases by central banks hit 50-year highs. China's CIPS processed record volumes. The dollar's share of global reserves continued its decline, dropping faster than any time since World War II. And here's the final twist of this section, the one that explains why the timeline is accelerating beyond anything historical precedent would suggest. When Britain weaponized finance in 1914, there was no alternative. Countries had to use sterling because nothing else existed. They had to wait decades for alternatives to emerge. But in 2022, alternatives already existed. CIPS was operational. SPFS was operational. Cryptocurrency provided backup channels. The infrastructure for a non-dollar world was already built. Countries didn't need to wait for alternatives. They just needed a reason to use them. America provided that reason. Financial weapons are like nuclear weapons. You can only use them once. After you deploy them, everyone builds defenses. The SWIFT cutoff didn't isolate Russia. It demonstrated that isolation was survivable. It didn't preserve dollar dominance. It convinced half the world to escape dollar dependence. It didn't strengthen America. It accelerated America's decline. The weapon worked tactically. Russia faced real economic pain. But strategically, it was suicide. America taught the world to build alternatives, and now those alternatives exist, growing stronger every month, processing more transactions every quarter, pulling more countries into a parallel financial system that America cannot control. The consequences of that miscalculation are about to become irreversible. Empires don't collapse in a day. They erode. They weaken at the edges while the center still looks strong. They lose allies before they lose armies. They lose trust before they lose territory. And by the time most people notice the decline, it's already irreversible. The dollar won't collapse tomorrow. There won't be a single dramatic moment where the world announces it's abandoning American currency. That's what most people get wrong about this. They're waiting for a crash, some financial 9/11 that changes everything overnight. It won't happen that way. Instead, the dollar will die the way all dominant currencies die. Slowly, quietly, one transaction at a time, one reserve allocation at a time, one trade deal at a time. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Let me show you what the next decade looks like, through the lives of people who will live it. Michael Torres is 42 years old, a mid-level portfolio manager at a pension fund in Ohio. He manages retirement savings for roughly 23,000 public employees, teachers, firefighters, municipal workers. The fund holds $4.2 billion in assets, and like most American pension funds, approximately 60% is allocated to dollar-denominated investments, treasury bonds, U.S. equities, corporate debt. Michael doesn't worry about the dollar. He's never had to. The dollar has been the world's safe haven his entire career. But here's what Michael's trajectory looks like over the next 10 years. By 2028, inflation has persisted at levels the Federal Reserve can't control without triggering recession. The pension fund's treasury holdings, paying 4.5% interest, are losing real value at 2 to 3% annually after inflation. By 2030, foreign central banks have reduced dollar reserves to below 50% of global holdings, down from 57% in 2024. Demand for treasuries weakens, yields rise, bond prices fall. Michael's portfolio takes a 15% haircut. By 2034, the pension fund faces a choice: reduce benefits, increase contributions from current workers, or pray for a miracle. Michael, now 52, will spend his final working years explaining to retired teachers why their checks are shrinking. Picture him in a community center, fluorescent lights overhead, facing a room full of 70-year-olds who trusted the system, trying to explain monetary policy to people who just want to know why they can't afford their medications. Now contrast that with Li Xiaoming. Li is 38, a fund manager in Shanghai who specializes in gold-backed securities and yuan-denominated emerging market bonds. In 2024, his fund manages roughly $800 million, modest by global standards. But Li saw the swift cutoff and understood immediately what it meant. He began shifting allocations away from dollar assets into gold, into yuan instruments, into commodities. By 2028, as dollar assets stagnate, his portfolio has outperformed Western benchmarks by 40%. By 2030, foreign institutions desperate for non-dollar returns are flooding into Chinese markets. Li's fund has grown to $3.2 billion. By 2034, he's managing over $8 billion, and his clients, pension funds from Thailand, sovereign wealth funds from the Gulf, insurance companies from Brazil, are congratulating themselves on getting out of dollars early. Li will spend his 50s as one of the most respected fund managers in Asia, lecturing at conferences about how he saw the transition coming. Same decade, same global economy, two completely different outcomes. The only difference is which side of the dollar decline they stood on. Here's a question that should haunt American policymakers. If you knew the swift weapon would accelerate dollar decline, would you still have used it? Because the data is now undeniable. In 2022, before the sanctions, CIPS, China's alternative to SWIFT, processed about $14 trillion annually. By 2024, that number exceeded $21 trillion. Project the growth curve forward. By 2030, CIPS will likely process more international transactions than SWIFT itself. Imagine a chart with two lines, one flat, one rising exponentially, crossing somewhere around 2029. That crossing point is when the dollar system becomes the alternative, and the yuan system becomes the default.
Remember Arun Raghavan, the Indian central bank official who helped redesign India's reserve strategy? His counterpart in Washington is a woman named Patricia Hendricks. At 51, Patricia spent 23 years at the Treasury Department, the last 8 in the Office of International Affairs monitoring sanctions policy. She believed in the SWIFT weapon. She helped design it. In March 2022, she thought they'd won. Russia will be on its knees within 6 months, she told colleagues at an internal briefing. Patricia retired in 2026, disillusioned. The day she left, the dollar's reserve share had fallen another 2 percentage points. China had just completed its first major oil purchase from Saudi Arabia, settled entirely in yuan. The BRICS payment system was processing transactions from 63 countries. Everything Patricia had worked for, maintaining dollar dominance through financial leverage, was unraveling. She spends her retirement writing op-eds that nobody publishes anymore, trying to explain that the sanctions were necessary, that the alternative was worse. But even she knows, in the quiet hours, that she helped pull the trigger on American hegemony. The timeline is set, and the timeline matches historical precedent almost perfectly. Remember Britain in 1914, weaponizing finance against Germany and losing reserve currency status by 1944. 30 years from weapon deployment to currency dethronement. The United States weaponized SWIFT in 2022. Add 30 years. That gives you 2052. But here's the contrarian point. The decline will be faster this time. Much faster. When Britain lost sterling dominance, there was only one alternative: the dollar. Countries had nowhere else to go. The transition took decades because the infrastructure had to be built from scratch. But when America loses dollar dominance, multiple alternatives already exist. The yuan. The euro, if Europe ever finds the courage to break from Washington. Digital currencies that bypass traditional banking entirely. Gold, which has no nationality and can't be frozen by any government. The infrastructure for a post-dollar world isn't theoretical. It's operational. Countries don't need 30 years to transition. They need 10, maybe less. So what does America look like in 2034 if the current trajectory continues? Here's the uncomfortable math. The United States currently runs a trade deficit of approximately $800 billion per year. That means Americans consume $800 billion more than they produce annually. This is only sustainable because foreigners accept dollars. They sell us goods, we pay them in currency we print, and they hold that currency as reserves or recycle it into treasury bonds. This is the exorbitant privilege that lets Americans live beyond their means. When dollar demand falls, that privilege evaporates. The U.S. must either export more, import less, or watch the dollar's purchasing power decline. For the average American household, let's call them the Martinez family in Phoenix, 2 working parents, 2 kids, household income of $78,000. This means prices rising faster than wages. Not hyperinflation, not Venezuela, just a steady erosion. The cheap Chinese electronics, the affordable imported clothes, the $3 coffee that costs $1.50 to produce abroad. All of it gets more expensive as the dollar weakens. By 2034, the Martinez family's purchasing power has declined roughly 20% relative to 2024. They're not poor, they're not starving, they're just less. Fewer vacations, older cars, smaller retirement accounts. Their children will be the first American generation in a century to have a lower standard of living than their parents. Not because of any disaster, just because the free lunch ended. And here's the question nobody wants to answer. Could this have been avoided? Remember what Yelena Kozlova said, the Russian SPFS engineer who switched over her systems in 72 hours? The Americans thought we'd collapse. We'd been preparing for 8 years. Russia prepared because America threatened. China accelerated CIPS because America demonstrated it would weaponize finance. Saudi Arabia explored yuan pricing because America froze Russian reserves. Every step in the dollar's decline was a response to American action. The weapon didn't preserve dominance. The weapon destroyed it. The cruelest irony is this. The sanctions were supposed to punish Russia for aggression. Instead, they punished ordinary Russians like Dmitry Volkov, while Putin remained in power. They punished ordinary Americans whose retirement savings will erode over the next decade. They punished ordinary people everywhere who trusted the dollar system to remain neutral. The elites adapted. They always do. The people who made the decisions that destroyed dollar hegemony will retire comfortably. The people who pay the price will be teachers in Ohio, and families in Phoenix, and retirees everywhere who believed the system was stable. Financial weapons kill slowly. The wounds don't bleed, they compound. The damage isn't visible until it's irreversible. And the next 10 years will prove whether anything can still be saved. So where are we now? Not in theory, not in projection. Right now, today, as you watch this. In January 2025, the dollar's share of global reserves sits at roughly 56%, down 5 points from 2022, a decline that previously took 2 decades compressed into 3 years. CIPS processed a record volume last quarter. BRICS has expanded to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran, collectively representing over 40% of world oil production. Central bank gold purchases remain at 50-year highs for the 3rd consecutive year. The petrodollar crack that opened with Mohammed bin Salman's phone call has widened into a fracture that cannot be repaired. And yet, if you turn on financial news tonight, none of this will be the headline. The pattern repeats not because it's hidden, but because it's slow. Slow enough to ignore. Slow enough to rationalize. Slow enough that by the time most people notice, the transition is already complete. Let me take you back to St. Petersburg. Dmitry Volkov, the 53-year-old engineer who watched his savings freeze in February 2022, is now 56. His daughter's wedding happened, smaller than planned, but filled with joy. His dollar account was eventually converted to rubles at a devastating exchange rate, costing him roughly 30% of his life savings. But here's what's changed. Dmitry no longer holds any foreign currency. Neither do his colleagues. Neither does anyone he knows. We learned the lesson, he says now. Your money is only safe in your own system. Picture Dmitry at his kitchen table. The same kitchen where he stood 3 years ago watching his world collapse, now explaining to his grandson why Russia builds its own payment networks, why they stockpile gold, why they trust no currency they don't control. A generation of Russians will grow up with this lesson embedded in their understanding of the world. Across the Pacific, Chen Wei is still at CIPS in Shanghai. His team has doubled in size. The inquiries that flooded in after February 2022 have become permanent partnerships. Banks from Thailand, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, all connected to China's alternative to SWIFT. Chen doesn't think about the dollar much anymore. He thinks about throughput, latency, security protocols, the technical challenges of building infrastructure for half the world's trade. The Americans did us a favor, he told a colleague recently. They proved we were necessary. Here's the contrarian point that I want you to sit with. This wasn't inevitable. The dollar didn't have to decline this fast. American hegemony didn't have to crack this soon. Every step of the acceleration, CIPS expansion, BRICS coordination, the petrodollar fracture, the reserve diversification, was a response to American action. The weapon created the wound. The wound
created the scar tissue. The scar tissue is now a parallel system that will outlast the wound that caused it. Remember Patricia Hendricks, the Treasury official who helped design the SWIFT sanctions and retired disillusioned in 2026? She understood something that her colleagues refused to accept. "We thought we were punishing Russia," she wrote in an unpublished memoir. "We were teaching the world to escape." That single sentence captures the entire tragedy. The U.S. had the most powerful financial weapon in history. It used that weapon, and in using it, it destroyed the weapon forever. So what do you do with this information? I want to be clear about something. This video isn't financial advice. I'm not telling you to buy gold or sell dollars or move your money to Singapore. I don't know your situation, your risk tolerance, your time horizon. What I'm offering is something different, a framework for thinking about the next 20 years. Not predictions, pattern recognition. Ask yourself 3 questions. First, what percentage of your wealth is denominated in a single currency? And would that percentage make sense if that currency lost reserve status? Second, what decisions would you make differently if you knew, not suspected, but knew, that the system you trust could change fundamentally within your lifetime? Third, if you're wrong about the timeline, what's the cost of being wrong early versus being wrong late? These aren't questions with universal answers. They're questions that force you to confront assumptions you may not know you're making. The pattern that started in 1914, when Britain weaponized finance against Germany, that pattern is completing now. Britain controlled 65% of reserves in 1914. 30 years later, sterling was finished. America weaponized SWIFT in 2022. The clock is running. Technology compresses timelines. Alternatives already exist. The 30-year window that Britain had may be 20 years for America, maybe 15. Remember the Martinez family in Phoenix, the household whose purchasing power will erode 20% over the next decade? They won't experience the decline as a crisis. They'll experience it as a new normal. Slightly harder each year, slightly less abundant. Their children will never know what their parents took for granted. That's how reserve currency status ends, not in disaster, but in diminishment. Not in collapse, but in compression. And remember Li Xiaoming in Shanghai, whose fund will grow from $800 million to $8 billion by riding the dollar's decline? He's not lucky. He's not prescient. He simply understood that when the dominant power weaponizes its own tools of dominance, those tools stop working. He positioned accordingly. The transition will create losers, but it will also create winners. The question is which side of the shift you stand on. Here's the re-anchor. I haven't shown you this pattern to scare you. I haven't laid out this history to convince you the world is ending. The world isn't ending. It's changing. And there's a profound difference between the two. Empires rise and fall. Currencies gain and lose dominance. Systems that seem permanent reveal themselves to be temporary. This has happened before. It will happen again. Understanding the mechanism doesn't require panic. It requires clarity. The 5-stage pattern is almost complete. The U.S. controlled SWIFT and the dollar. The U.S. weaponized them against Russia. Russia found alternatives. 50-plus countries are now hedging. The weapon is losing power. This isn't speculation, it's observation. The stages are visible to anyone willing to look. Financial weapons are like nuclear weapons. You can only use them once. After you use them, everyone builds defenses. The SWIFT cutoff didn't preserve American dominance. It triggered the countdown to American decline. Not through military defeat, not through economic collapse, through the slow, irreversible erosion of trust. And that's the signature line of everything you've watched today. America had the golden goose, and it strangled it with sanctions.
China didn't defeat the United States militarily. China didn't need to. America defeated itself by weaponizing the tools of its own power. The dollar weapon destroyed dollar hegemony. The SWIFT weapon destroyed SWIFT's monopoly. The sanctions that were supposed to isolate Russia instead isolated America from the future. 20 years from now, historians will look back at February 2022, the frozen reserves, the SWIFT cutoff, the day the West deployed its nuclear option, and they'll mark it as the turning point. The moment when American financial dominance began its terminal decline. The moment when the world learned the lesson it will never forget. The lesson is simple. Never be vulnerable to a power that will weaponize your vulnerability. The world learned. The world is acting, and the transition has already begun. The only question left is whether you'll understand what's happening before it's finished, or whether you'll be one of the millions who look back and say, "I didn't see it coming." But you did see it. You just watched it. The pattern is clear. The timeline is set. The weapon was used.
And weapons, once used, cannot be unused.